All right, hello. Welcome to Chapter 9, The Geography of Population. Let's get right into this. There's a lot of fun stuff in this chapter, I think. But let's talk about population. As we talked about before, the population of the Earth is roughly 7.5 billion. We looked right here. And that's a live link. Let's see where we're at right now. So, according to this, right, per population. Oh, let's see what they got here. So, this is a live update, too, unfortunately. Um, Not as cheerful as the other one, but you can see that, right? It's getting close to over 1 million cases. And if we look by country, I know that we are currently the most cases right here. 18,000 new cases. That's just a quick jump. So, anyway, all this talks here is just another way of looking at population. So let's close this site here. Right? Different ways of looking at measuring population. So the first thing we'll talk about today is distribution. In other words, people live on land, obviously, but we don't live in the water and we don't live in certain parts of the land. So it's not like we're evenly spaced. We cluster. And this map just shows you that if you map the amount of people by latitude, north or south, most people live on Earth right about this band right here, which is 30 degrees north. More people live at this distance north than anywhere else. And if you think about why would there be less people living north and south, well, think about it. It gets cold, so it's colder up here and it's very cold down here. And also down here, if you notice, right here, less land than up here. So the land that is available and warm enough for us to live in is clustered right here, and so our population clusters that way. And if also it reflects our reliance on agriculture. I mean, up until recently, we had to live near farms for food, and the most fertile farm fields tend to be right through here and right through here. There's just more land to feed people. When we look at the same thing east and west, we see the largest concentrations here in Asia, right here, and also here through Europe. And that reflects our concentration on industrial areas. So this reflects our historical clustering near fertile farmland. But this kind of reflects how people began to move to cities within those areas. Okay, and so when we look at population and where people live and where they don't, this all goes back to Tobler's law. Remember that everything is related, but all things being equal, things that are closer together are closer related. In other words, who you are depends on where you are. If you are here or born here, you're an American. If you're born in China, you're Chinese, right? Now there are some differences. If you look at the world's population, this is the world's population, right? China has the largest population, 18, almost 19%. India's right behind. But we are the third largest population, 4%, followed by Indonesia, you can see. And what's interesting is that one thing with this, right? The more population you have, the more power you have. There's some reasons for that. First of all, if you have more people, you have a bigger workforce, a bigger source of potential soldiers. So you have that, right? You've got that power of the people kind of a thing. Now, there are some advantages to this to large countries and disadvantages. So large countries may have more weight, if you will, right? But the thing is, less national coherence. So right now, in China, besides the coronavirus going on, there's been this huge issue in China. Even though people may be Chinese citizens, not everybody is ethnically Chinese. When we think of ethnically Chinese, we're thinking of the people that speak Mandarin, live in the eastern half of the country, and that is the Chinese culture that goes back for thousands of years. In Western China, people there actually don't speak Chinese as their first language. They speak languages that are closer related to Turkish, and they may be Muslim. So they may be part of China, but they're not ethnically Chinese. In fact, they make different names like the Uyghurs or the Turkmens, and there's a lot of conflict because different groups maybe have different goals, and there's a lot of talk that a lot of people who are in China don't want to be part of China. Tibet's a great example. So even though China is a large country, it has to work harder to keep that together, right? So then you would argue that maybe smaller countries, well, they have it easier. If you're a smaller country, like say Cuba or islands in the Caribbean, if you're on the island of Barbados, your population is less than that of the city of Chicago. It's less than 100,000 people. And they're all pretty homogenous, pretty much the same culture. And that doesn't have its strengths, but they're more vulnerable. If a hurricane goes through the island of Barbados and kills 200 people, that's a bigger hit than if it hits the United States and kills 200 people, because we have a population of 300 million versus 100,000. So another thing about population is the way a culture or a population visualizes itself. And this doesn't have to be based in fact. The idea of national myths, how they view themselves, right? And sometimes talks about the spatial nature of the state. So a big example here is that the idea of the American cowboy. It's kind of a prevalent myth, right? The idea of the American, the tough American who drives the pickup truck and wears cowboy boots and jean jackets and lives out in the country. And that's a very specific image, right? But the reality is most Americans live in cities like Chicago. Most Americans don't drive pickup trucks and have never ridden a horse, right? So this brings the question then: if that is the heartland of America, if you watch the uh, NFL or if you watch NASCAR or national sports, right, or advertising for beer, and they're kind of targeting that demographic, in reality, that's not really the heartland of America if you look at our actual population. More people live in Chicago than the rest of the state of Illinois combined. And this map kind of shows population in a 3D situation. So the taller the little tower, the more the people. And you can see here that New York, you know, is just a huge amount of people. So Chicago, very large. Los Angeles, San Francisco, more people live in the cities right here in these little towers than the rest of this whole mid area combined. And this is supposedly the heartland, the American West, right? That also comes into play when we talk about the demographic reality of political representation. So a good example is the American election. The last presidential election, 2016, Donald Trump became president, even though less people voted for him than his rival Hillary Clinton. How does that happen? In America, we vote by state. You actually don't vote for the president in this country when you vote. What happens is you vote for somebody in your state who is pledged to vote for that person. And each state has a set number of votes. So every state has a number of votes in the presidential election, and whoever gets that number of votes wins. So, for instance, in Illinois, we have 11 congressmen and 2 senators. So we get 11 plus 2, 13 votes, right? And who gets those 13 votes in Illinois? Whoever gets the most votes. So what happens is, instead of winning one election, when somebody runs for president, they actually have 50 elections, one for every state. And in any state, if they win one more vote than the other person, no matter how small it is, as long as they have the most votes, they win. And then you add those votes up. But here's the thing: not every state has equal votes. The votes that the states have is based on their population. So California has more votes because it has 45 votes. It has the most people in the country. New York State, because of New York City, has more votes than, say, some of these states in the middle of the country. Right up here in the Dakotas, North Dakota and South Dakota have 3 votes. California has 45. Texas, I believe, has 40 based on population. So what happens is, not only does that affect the presidency, Donald Trump lost in California and New York to Hillary Clinton, where she won more people and overall, but he won more states. When it comes to the U.S. Senate and the House, why is that a big deal? And this also happens in other countries too. Look at this chart. In the United States, the 5 largest states, so that would be California, New York, Texas, Illinois, and Florida. The 5 largest states have almost 40% of the population, but each state only gets 2 senators. Right? Now, the 5 smallest states by population, so that would be Alaska, Hawaii, I think North and South Dakota, Wyoming, they only have 1% of the people in the country. But every state gets 10 or gets 2 senators. So the 5 small states and the 5 largest states have the same amount of senators. But look at the difference. 120 million people only get 10 senators, where 3.5 million get 1. Do these people have more political power? In some ways they do. Now, why does that matter in the Senate? Well, the Senate is who chooses the Supreme Court justices. The Senate is who would vote to remove the president, and we just had an impeachment that went through that. So these states have a lot more power. than these states, even though they have less people. Now, we've talked about cumulative causation when it comes to economic growth, and the same thing happens with demographics, right? People move to areas of greater opportunity. So, as we talked about, if an area is growing and there's more jobs, that's going to drain more people. They're going to move there. But what happens is they're leaving somewhere, aren't they? Right? So, what happens is areas like Chicago that were once growing gain labor and demand, and states around them like Indiana and Wisconsin would lose people. In fact, recently it's been the opposite. People have been leaving Illinois due to high cost of living. It costs a lot to live here. Apartments are very expensive. Taxes. For a couple of years there, we had the whole issue with our governor not signing a budget. We had no budget, so there were a lot of issues. High taxes, jobs weren't coming. It was becoming too expensive to live here, and people were leaving Chicago. So we were draining, leaving people, and where were they going? California, Texas, Arizona, Florida, areas that are growing. Okay, so one of the things that the government of Illinois has tried to do is address that, stop people from leaving, maybe find a way to lower taxes or make it more affordable for businesses to go here. In Maine, certain parts of Maine, the population is aging. They're getting older and people are leaving. There's not no big cities. A lot of people go to school for college and don't come back. So some parts of Maine have offered a benefit. If you come and work here for 1 year, we'll pay off your student loans, right? Ways that we can kind of draw people back. And so it's kind of like that cumulative causation of economic growth that we talked about. If an area has having in migration, people are moving there. So let's talk about Florida and Texas. People are moving to Florida and Texas left and right. And as the population grows, it creates more demand for goods because if there's more people living there, they need more stores, more Targets, more gas stations, more schools, right? And also they need more police because there's more people and more fire. So all of that creates demands. They have to buy cars for the police department and they have to build more grocery stores. And what happens is that makes more employment. We got to hire people to do this. We got to hire people to work in the stores and hire people to build things and hire police officers and teachers. And that creates employment, which causes more people to move there. So it becomes kind of this self-feeding cycle. Conversely, where are these people coming from? They're migrating out of someplace. They're leaving someplace. And what happens when people leave? The population shrinks. So Illinois has lost roughly, I think I want to say in the last 10 years, has lost about 15,000 residents. They've moved out. And the population declines. Well, one thing that happens is if there's less people in a city or a state, right, there's less demand for goods and services. Another example is this. If you ever go to Gary, Indiana, right over the border, used to be a big, huge city. Huge city, lots of neighborhoods. Today, it's almost completely empty. You'll go down streets and almost every house but one are boarded up. Businesses are gone. There's no employment. And what happens? The factories there, the steel mills in the 60s and 70s, they closed. They moved to Taiwan or South Korea, and the jobs were gone. And what happens is declining employment. People are moving out. And as more people moved out, the population shrank, which meant there were less people going shopping, less people going to school, less people building houses, so less people were demanding those goods, and those people's jobs were gone, right? So the government of Gary, Indiana, one of the things they've tried to do over the years is try to figure out how to stop this. How can we stop population decline? Maybe we can make it more affordable to live here. We can. One of the reasons why they have casinos in Indiana is to bring employment back. So we're going to stop right here. I'm going to pause the video, and we'll come back with the next part in just a moment.